Okay, welcome folks. My name is Nevin Kamath, and here we are in the first episode of our leadership development series, How to Become a Leader in the Trump Resistance. And the name of the episode today is How We Win Nonviolent Civil Resistance. The Resist Trump campaign has, as its core principles, the following characteristics. We have a vision, which is a future without Trump and his enablers in power. That's our goal. We have a mission of lawful, nonviolent civil resistance to Trump and his enablers. And our values are collaboration, integrity, nonpartisanship, and professionalism. If you're interested in learning more about the Resist Trump campaign, I'm going to share a few facts in the chat to let you know how to do that. I've just put the orientation event from Mobilize on the chat, and it looks like we have some other information here that we can share too, such as the orientation guide, which I'll go ahead and do. All right. Great. So welcome, folks. My name, as I mentioned earlier, is Nevin. I sometimes go by Nev. And with me here is Tracy. Tracy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Tracy. I am a volunteer with Resist Trump, and I really enjoy it. I like being able to make a positive difference.
Awesome. Well, you are making a positive difference, and we really appreciate you, Tracy. Tracy's role tonight is going to be kind of like my co-moderator. She's going to be managing some of the tech aspects of this meeting, and I'll be the lead moderator for tonight. I'm going to set the chat to open so that we can hear a little bit from you all folks. So now the chat is open, I believe, and we'd love to hear from you about, a little bit about where you're from, why you're here, and what and who you are. So feel free to share that in the chat. In the meantime, I'm also going to share the First Amendment, which is relevant to today's meeting. So the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We're going to be using, 2 to 3 of those 5 freedoms in this very meeting: freedom of speech, freedom of the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is an exercise in constitutional rights that we're doing here today. So, what does this series look like? We have a number of different episodes that we're driving towards in this leadership development series, and people can join anytime. They don't have to join at the beginning. They can join halfway through or partway through. But there is a sequence where we're trying to have different modules and levels of participation, where initially, if folks want to join at the very beginning, they can focus on the first assignment, which is to host a get-together. Following that, there may be a good chance for folks to continue on their leadership journey and eventually run a lawful protest using some of our infrastructure from a technology point of view and the lessons and content that they learn in this series. Finally, the last assignment will be to start a resist pod. And if you're interested in learning more about the nature of this course, I strongly recommend that you check out our YouTube, where we have a number of videos, especially the video that covers episode 0, which took place last Thursday, June 12th, 2025. And it goes over the course in some serious depth as to what to expect over these 12 courses, 12 episodes. So what are we going to be doing today? And I see a lot of people are coming from different places, some people from Texas and Austin. I see some familiar folks. It's really great to see everyone. What are we going to be doing today? Sorry, one quick second. I'm just going to actually address what we're going to be learning in some of those courses. So in that yellow block, the actual episodes will be today's episode, the basics of nonviolent civil resistance. You can think of that as that first yellow block on the left. And then followed by how we fight, organizing, and resistance will be the second one. We'll follow that with digital hubs, or an episode on digital hubs. And then finally, an episode preparing you to do that first assignment. Then in the second block, or the second level, L2, knowing your rights will give you some basics for activists and organizers. Using social media will be the second one. Staying safe through de-escalation and digital security will be the third one. And then taking action, leading a lawful protest will be the last module leading to that assignment that I talked about. Finally, in the third level, we'll do advanced media techniques, defining the narrative and your opponents as that first red block. Then fundraising. So you're going to want to learn about the basics of fundraising, even if it's like a GoFundMe or even taking cash donations, that sort of thing. Advanced organizing, so next level resistance strategy, and then finally, from one to many will be the name of the last episode, and that'll be about starting a resist pod. So that is the overall arc of our leadership development webinar series, and we're really excited to take you on this journey, and also to welcome people who come into this journey part of the way through, because you might expect people to kind of jump in as we go, because this is meant to be a drop-in series. Ideally, if people join, they would join for one of the levels, but it's not necessary. People can join for a single webinar anyway through the course. So what are we doing today? Well, we're going to be talking about how authoritarianism affects us, followed by a breakout group where you can interact in smaller groups. We'll also do a Mentimeter, which is like an interactive exercise. We'll follow that with an exploration about what is nonviolent civil resistance with our guest tonight, Brian Register. He'll entertain a Q&A from the audience, and then we'll do a breakout group about an issue that you care about and thinking about how nonviolent civil resistance can affect it. We'll follow that with a Mentimeter, and then finally we'll end with a closing and give you some suggestions on where to go from here. Within the course, we have a number of elements that you can interact with that will allow you to further hone your leadership skills. So why don't we go ahead and get started with how authoritarianism affects us. I'm going to change the chat functions to what it is now. So now I've closed the chat just so we can all focus on the content, but we'll open up breakout rooms in a second so you can interact with each other in that space shortly. So this segment is called How Authoritarianism Affects Us, What We Lose, and What's at Stake. And it really starts with the idea that the US has traditionally been a beacon of democracy. This is my favorite picture of the Statue of Liberty. And whenever I see it, I am filled with pride at the hope that my country represents, both for its citizens and for aspiring citizens and allies around the world. For over 250 years, the US has been and has projected itself as a global symbol, right, of democratic values, which include self-government, civil liberties, and peaceful transitions of power. And we've prided ourselves on a number of things. Our founding ideals, such as those represented in the Constitution, which was a notable experiment in self-rule that many people believe was one of the first of its kind in human history. As well as the Declaration of Independence, which stated that the government derived its power from the consent of the governed. Since our founding, we've reached substantial global influence through things like the Marshall Plan, where the US played a role in helping to rebuild Europe both economically and democratically. We've supported post-colonial democracies, sometimes inconsistently, but still in a powerful way in the cases where we did. And civil rights leaders in the United States have inspired global freedom movements around the world. The Statue of Liberty means something, and it means something not just to me, but to a lot of people. Now, the US hasn't been like a utopia, right? It hasn't been perfect for any moment of its time. But despite its promise, right, or despite its promises, the US has struggled with things like slavery, segregation, imperialism, and disenfranchisement, as well as a number of other societal ills that I'm not yet even describing. But still, right, the US has long claimed and sometimes has fulfilled the role of democracy's global champion. That much is indisputable. Unfortunately, however, no democracy is immune from decay, and that even applies to us. So, what we're going to talk about now is something called the authoritarian playbook, which is a method of degrading and damaging democracies. And authoritarianism doesn't always arrive in dramatic fashion like a coup, right? It can often do what's called kind of sliding into place, step by step, often behind a facade, right? An image of legality. And so there's a really nice, or very, I wouldn't call it nice, but there's a very helpful speech that Larry Diamond, an expert on democracy at Stanford University, wrote that I've just put into the chat, which explores these elements of the authoritarian playbook. And in that speech, he, states that, the ways that democracies become authoritarian include the following: demonizing the opposition. And I want you to think of whether or not this is happening in the United States. Undermining the independence of the courts, undermining the independence of the media, gaining control of public broadcasting, imposing stricter control on the internet, subduing civil society NGOs and universities, intimidating the business community, enriching a new class of crony capitalists, extending political control over the state bureaucracy, gerrymandering constituencies and rigging electoral rules. Finally, gaining control over electoral administration and then repeating those steps until an authoritarian grip is firmly established. As I was going through those steps, many examples that I've seen in the news through a number of different news outlets came to mind that made me and helped me reflect that, man, this is really happening, right? And I don't think I'm the only one who sees this. There are some experts who have said that American democracy, because of the authoritarian nature of the current Trump administration, could be finished this year, right? As early as this year. This is a little meme that tries to make light of the fact that something bad is happening, and the protagonist in the meme is saying, "Well, everything is fine." I know that you don't believe that everything is fine because that's why you're here tonight. And one of the things that not only I am trying to do, but that hopefully you are trying to do too, is kind of wake people up from this situation where the house is on fire and they're not yet doing anything. Now, I know a lot of people are getting into the game, but we need more people to get into the game. And by educating you and others that you know, that can start to happen. So there's an expert, Staffan Lindberg, who's the head of the Varieties of Democracy Project, which is run out of Sweden's University of Gothenburg. And the Varieties of Democracy Project, I'll put a link to that in the chat, has claimed that the US could lose democracy status this year in an article that I'll also put in the chat. That's where this claim comes from. And what would that look like? What would an authoritarian government look like for people in society? Well, we can look to other countries and get a sense, right? So if we were to look at countries across issues that government impacts, like free speech and information, or elections and civic participation, policing and protest, healthcare and public services, education and curriculum, right? Legal rights and protections, all things that make a difference to you in subtle but very important ways and shape your life, right? And shape the way you interact with other people in society in a rule-based system. When we take a look at other countries that are experiencing authoritarianism, with free speech and information, in countries that are, journalists are jailed or intimidated, that leads to self-censorship or propaganda that dominates the news. You've got social media posts which are monitored or criminalized so that people hesitate to share political opinions online. Sometimes you'll have misinformation that floods the public, which makes it very hard to even trust facts or verify what's true. And so, as an example, in Hungary, the independent media outlets have been either bought out or shuttered, and that's left government-friendly news as the primary source. Next, we've got elections and civic participation. And in authoritarian regimes, voter suppression tactics like ID laws and poll closures and purges will disproportionately affect marginalized communities. And people will stop voting because they feel elections are rigged or meaningless. Sometimes activists are surveilled or harassed, and that discourages civic organizing. As an example, in Russia, opposition candidates are routinely disqualified or imprisoned, leaving voters with no real choices. As far as policing and protest, right? Peaceful protesters in authoritarian regimes are either criminalized or violently dispersed, which chills public dissent. New laws will ban or restrict demonstrations, limiting the rights of freedom of expression. Police will act as political enforcers and target regime critics. As an example, in Egypt, peaceful demonstrators, including students and human rights advocates, are frequently arrested, beaten, and tried in military courts. In healthcare and public services, you'll find under authoritarian regimes that minority or opposition communities face discrimination in service delivery. You'll find that government critics could lose access to aid or jobs or licenses because they are critics. And COVID policies, to use that example, can sometimes be used as excuses to consolidate power or punish dissenters. As an example, in China, critical doctors, doctors who are critical of the regime, were silenced or disappeared during the pandemic. In authoritarian regimes, in education and curriculum, textbooks are rewritten to reflect nationalistic or distorted historical narratives. Teachers are fired for discussing unapproved topics. Libraries and schools will ban books and narrow people's worldviews. And as an example, in Hungary, textbooks now reflect a right-wing and revisionist view of World War II, which downplays Hungary's role in the Holocaust. Finally, in authoritarian regimes, legal rights and protections are also affected. Courts can become politicized, offering no protection against abuses of power. Whistleblowers and journalists lose legal immunity. Ordinary citizens can be sued or jailed for insulting leaders or spreading falsehoods. And as an example, in Turkey, thousands have been prosecuted for insulting the president on social media. And so while these patterns in these different countries, right, may seem distant or traditionally confined to authoritarian regimes in other places, the reality is that many of the same tactics are now unfolding here in the United States. This is not just happening here, but it's happening here quickly. There's a quote by an expert on authoritarianism from last month in an interview who said, honestly, the speed at which this is happening and the kind of concentrated push to do this doesn't have any parallel in situations where leaders came to power through elections. This is a historian, right? If you look at the early Putin or the early Orban or Erdogan, they did not move at this speed. This resembles more like there's been a coup. That's what's actually happening right now. And how is it happening? Well, let's go back to those same categories. Free speech and information. The Trump administration continues to publicly discredit media outlets and individual reporters. They're framing them as adversaries, and this can fuel federal pressure by limiting press access to the White House. The Trump administration is also attempting to defund public broadcasting channels like NPR and PBS in elections and civic participation. Trump has signed numerous executive orders that are aimed at rolling back voting protections. And this proposed SAVE Act imposes new federal level barriers on who can register to vote and how. With policing and protest, Trump has signaled an intent to deploy federal or National Guard forces in a rare and unprecedented way to control protests and to enforce immigration policy. And the DC military parade on June 14th drew massive protests nationwide and also invited a strong National Guard response. In healthcare and public services, under RFK's leadership, the Department of Health and Human Services has undergone serious transformation from an ideological point of view. It's been marked by mass firings, by defunding of key agencies, and the sidelining, right? The sidelining of scientific and public health expertise. In education and curriculum, Trump has signed orders curtailing diversity programs, as we all know, in federal education and service sectors. And finally, with regards to legal rights and protections, within hours of his inauguration, Trump issued sweeping pardons, approximately 1,500 for the people who were involved in the Capitol riot. And that indicates a tolerance for political violence. An executive order that prohibits federal recognition of gender identity has also been issued, and that affects civil and legal protections for transgender individuals. So, in summary, what we're seeing, right, is that authoritarianism is no longer this distant threat. It is currently unfolding right here in the United States. So, in the next segment, the immediate next segment, we're going to do a breakout room to reflect on how these changes are impacting our own lives and communities. So, what I want to challenge you folks to do is consider, how is Trump's authoritarianism affecting you personally? Let me see if I could jump into a Menti question now. The Menti question that we aim to just hear about from you folks asks, how is Trump's authoritarianism showing up in your life or community? You had a chance to discuss that with folks. Let's now go through a Menti exercise. So Menti is basically like a website where you just type in menti.com, MENTI, right? And then I'm going to go to the actual the actual Menti for today. You just type in MENTI, and here we go. Present. Just give it a second. And then we can all do this together. Maybe go to your phone and type that in your phone's browser. Might be the easiest way to do it. And then use the code that you see at the top, which is 13619699. And then try and respond. And we're going to give you a few minutes to do that. But try and respond either on your phone or if you did it on your computer, either way, to the question that it's asking you, which is, in a phrase or a single sentence, How is Trump's authoritarianism showing up in your life or your community? So, what we're seeing so far are things like family estrangement, employment insecurity, fear and isolation, causing fear to live a normal life without being kidnapped, food insecurity, fear for my future. Wow. Fear of going out in the streets. My farmer friend can't get enough workers. Loss of protections and services. Possibility that my partner will be deported. So intense, right? So real. So we wanted to make the authoritarianism very, real and not just talk about it theoretically, but really bring it to life in terms of what people, um, are actually experiencing. Luckily, we have the opportunity to discuss ways to counter authoritarianism through nonviolent civil resistance. We are very lucky today to have a guest speaker, Brian Register, who is the adjunct professor, or who is an adjunct professor of philosophy at Austin Community College in Austin, where I live. A little bit about Brian is that he went to UT Austin from 1994 to 2006, earning a Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies and Bachelor's of Arts in History and Philosophy, a Master of Arts in Philosophy, and a PhD in Philosophy for his dissertation. Brian has taught at Northeast Lakeview Community College, Austin Community College, Texas State University, George Mason University, and the University of Texas at Austin. His book, Ayn Rand and the Age of Spite, is under review. And it is my pleasure to welcome Brian to the stage today. Brian, I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. And when it goes up, I will let you know that we have reached the end of your time and maybe you can conclude then if you don't conclude before. Does that sound okay to you? Okay, great. So I will now start the timer and the floor is all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm Brian, as Evan said, and I'm not a scholar of civil disobedience, but I can read some of the books, and I have a philosophy and history background, and a communications background, all of which kind of helps me to interpret it, sometimes to convey it. Nevin asked me if I could just kind of talk through what civil resistance is, and that's what I'll try to do. I do want to start with a word about being a leader in the resistance. So we need leaders in the sense of people who are persistent. Our need for leaders in the sense of people who are at the front of a column, and especially leaders in the sense of people giving orders, that is more limited. I mean, the movement as a whole does need some such people, but it doesn't need to be composed mainly of them. So I hope that what you're going to take from these webinars is some notions for how and why to be persistent, and that you'll try to graduate up to a guiding other people's role as it's necessary and as you have experience. So let's say some of the terms that are often associated with civil resistance historically. So the first historical term that kind of nodded in the direction of what we nowadays call civil resistance was civil disobedience. And this was a phrase that Henry David Thoreau coined when he wrote his book by the same title. Thoreau was in prison for refusing to pay a one-time war tax during the Mexican-American War that the state of Massachusetts had tried to charge him because he thought that the Mexican-American War was an imperialistic land grab, which it was. And so Thoreau advocated that people very peacefully break the law if the law was sufficiently unjust. And so it was going to be disobedience, but it was going to be civil. You'd break a law, but it wasn't going to be a law against assault or arson or murder or something like that. So that is an early version of a phrase meaning roughly what we're talking about. It's also been called nonviolent resistance. That was especially the term used for the American Civil Rights Movement, and it was also used for the independence movement in India in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And that emphasizes the fact that it's intended to be a kind of revolution, but of a very distinctive kind, a kind that you don't need to be afraid of because they're not coming to hurt you. There's another word, and this is a Hindi word, satyagraha, which I might have mispronounced, but that was Gandhi's term for it. And that apparently literally means truth force, right? So the idea was that the mass of people who were engaging in civil resistance were sort of witnessing a truth to a broader audience who would eventually be kind of compelled to act according to it, even though they didn't really want to. It's also been called people power. That was especially the name of a nonviolent movement in the 1980s in the Philippines to remove Ferdinand Marcos from power. And that emphasizes the fact that masses, large quantities of people are highly relevant to what we're trying to do. So only one of those, civil disobedience, really has a fairly precise meaning, and that is the intentional breaking of a law non-violently with the expectation of suffering legal consequences. The rest of these, including the term civil resistance, they're pretty loose ideas. They're not really highly definable, which is, can be a weakness and a strength depending on how it is that you're trying to use them. Only one of them, satyagraha, is associated with, in specific, a principled pacifism. The others of these phrases, they're certainly not associated with violence or aggression or force, but the rest of them aren't militantly pacifist in the same way that Gandhi was. So here is an idea that we can get from a political philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was writing in the 1700s. He was kind of doing some of the fundamental thinking for how a democratic republic should work, would work, how it could be legitimate, and so forth. And he contended that a social group has a power to act as a kind of a collective agent. So to act as one group is not one person, but it's one agent of a certain kind. And that is determined by the number of its members divided by the number of its decision makers. So if you have your entire group of like 1 million people and they all automatically obey one person, they can act as 1 million-person unit. Whereas if they have like 1,000 decision makers, then they're actually kind of acting as 1,000-person units, which isn't nearly as powerful. The power of the social group can also be determined by the number of people divided by the amount of time that it takes to engage in a consultation if the decision-making process is consultative, right? So if you have an absolute monarch with immediate complete obedience from everybody, that gives you a social group with the maximum possible power. If you have perfect anarchy with no coordination between anybody, that has no power, no social power at all. It is not a group in any meaningful sense. A monarch who has to listen to everybody is somewhere in between. And a process where people deliberate for a while and then everybody abides by a majority vote, that is also somewhere in between, right? So that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be, as a country, a social grouping that's pretty powerful because we will, in the end, act as one, but not overwhelmingly powerful because we're supposed to slow down and really think about it an awful lot. Right? Well, we can apply the same thought to groups of people who are oppressive within a society, groups of people who are resisting within a society. What this means, though, is if you can get the different people in a social group that is exercising power as a group to make decisions independently, then the group is less powerful, right? So if you take all of the Trumpists and they immediately obey Trump's decision that he makes without consulting anybody, you have an enormously powerful social group. But if you take all of the Trumpists and then convince an awful lot of them to make their own decisions, even though they might technically still want to identify with the social group and stuff like that, still, it isn't nearly as powerful. Right? The objective of civil resistance is to persuade more people to make their own decisions, thereby fracturing the overall power structure. Right? So you can think of kind of discrete groups of people whose actions empower a leader or make it so that the leader is the decision maker for the group. You can think of such a discrete group or an institution as a pillar of support for the regime, right? That can be the media. It can be police, it can be organized religion, it can be academy education, right? It can be kind of groups of people who just are affiliated with one another. It can be groups of people in a specific sub-institution. Some of those pillars of support the regime by implementing its decisions, and that's especially the police, military, things like that. Some, on the other hand, are pillars of support by supporting the regime by way of fostering obedience to it or support for it, or at least acquiescence in its decisions. That might be media, religion, things like that. And I understand that a lot of the future webinar episodes are going to be kind of about some of those pillars of support in our society and how it is that they can be interacted with. War is the use of violence to disrupt social power. And you can think of that metaphorically as war pushes the pillars of support until they atomize. And then the group has no more social power. It has lost its coherence, right? The people are mostly still there, but they're no longer acting with any kind of coherence. They no longer are following a centralized decision-making procedure. Civil resistance is the use of other means to disrupt social power. Metaphorically, it pulls the pillars of support until the regime has no more social power. You've gotten the members of the pillars to make decisions independently. So you didn't beat people into not talking with one another anymore. You convinced some of them to stop listening to someone. It's a very different kind of a mechanism. So civil resistance overlaps with war in one way. They are both dedicated to the elimination of a structure that coordinates people so that they cumulatively have a certain social power. But it overlaps with normal politics, like elections and persuasion and advocacy, in another way. They appeal to at least some people as reasoning beings, right? Normal politics and civil resistance, neither one of them walks up to somebody and punches them. They're both ultimately about trying to reason with people, albeit that in civil resistance, sometimes the process of reasoning is pretty hazardous, pretty vocal, pretty noisy. There's a common misimpression that civil resistance is pacifism. It isn't. Civil resistance eschews, it rejects a violent strategy. But civil resistance movements historically have sometimes used violence as pinpricks, not very often. They have often used violence in self-defense. And they have also often used violence in the very last stage of the overthrow of a regime, right? So it has happened in a number of cases that there has been a civil resistance movement that has prompted the military to give up on a regime, and that leads to a brief moment of fighting between a military that is now on the side of the people and a regime's dead-end supporters, right? So it isn't inherently, intrinsically pacifistic. Furthermore, civil resistance has often used vandalism and sabotage as tactics. And you might think that those are violent. I think that they do fall under the meaning of the word violent, but people sometimes disagree about that. I'm going to give you an example. So in the 1950s, there was an American journalist named William Worthy, and he was visiting a reverend you probably heard of, Martin Luther King Jr., and he was at his house, and he was about to sit down. And a legendary civil rights activist, Bayard Rustin, who there was a movie about a couple of years ago, stopped him from sitting down because he was about to sit on two of Dr. King's revolvers that were in the chair. Dr. King was not a pacifist. He was a gun owner, right? I mean, he did not intend to get hurt, right? So principled pacifists are definitely committed to civil resistance, but you do not have to be a pacifist to commit to civil resistance. Right. And that is, of course, not an appeal to be violent, but most people who engage in civil resistance aren't pacifists. They just think that you can't use a big violent action as a way to gain power in a just way that's going to be fair in the long run. That doesn't mean that they think you need to, in every case, just be beaten up or something like that. Civil resistance has also often used civil disobedience as a tactic, but disobedience is not violent. The laws to be broken are not the laws against assault or murder, right? So the civil rights movement in the South regularly broke a lot of laws, but they did not regularly break laws against, arson or rape or something like that. The tactic of protest is one of the main overlaps between civil resistance and normal politics. So civil resistance employs boycotts, strikes, various illegal refusals, sometimes to uh, illegal refusals to obey, often specifically an illegal refusal to get out of the way of troops or police. Right now, the main national resistance groups like Indivisible and 5051 have so far only called protests, and they have not made specific demands that would remove a regime from power. So it isn't plain whether we are currently at kind of a high tide of a normal politics protest movement or in the initial stages of a more aggressive civil resistance movement. And I think that we're here because we're afraid that we're at the second. And that's going to be determined partly by the courts, partly by Trump, partly by the Democratic Party, and largely by us. Right. Right this minute, the closest people are coming to being a real civil resistance movement beyond normal politics is when they are physically preventing ICE abductions. And you'll note that that is only of questionable legality. Right. All right. There is another misimpression. People sometimes think that civil resistance is kind of between normal politics and war. And I did say it's like war in one way, but like normal politics in another. But it isn't between them, right? In terms of the demands that it places on practitioners, it can become warlike, but violence is not like an extreme boycott, right? So it's not like you've got normal politics and then a boycott, and then you do the boycott really hard, and that's when you start bombing people, right? You could think of violence as maybe extreme sabotage, but the line is actually fairly bright. Once you start targeting people or have to target them to achieve your goal, you are no longer engaging in civil resistance. At that point, you're a terrorist or you're engaging in civil war or something like that. And that is, morally problematic, but it's certainly not part of civil resistance. Historically, civil resistance is at least twice as effective as civil war in achieving regime change. Now, since 2010, civil resistance has declined in its effectiveness globally, but civil war has declined even more. Let's see, how much time do I have? Where is that timer?
I've got you at about 20 seconds left, but you can wind up with however many minutes you need, knowing that that's where the time's sort of set right now, Brian.
Okay. So yeah, let me kind of bump down. So the reason that civil resistance works is not because of the immediate moral superiority of nonviolent resistors. It's because violent resistance requires that you be able to train and be willing to suffer violence and also engage in it, which means that mostly it's going to be engaged in by young men, right? It cannot mobilize a mass of the population, and it can't really mobilize a diverse portion of the population. Whereas when you have civil resistance, in principle, anybody can participate. I mean, in one way or another. I mean, some people are going to be on the front lines and they're going to be taking more risks. Some people are going to be very persistent. That's leaders, right? But you don't need to commit yourself to doing violence, and you don't have to travel. You don't have to live in a camp or something like that. What that means is that you have an awful lot of people. And when you have a lot of people, that means that you have a lot of ideas, right? Like Americans are supposed to have an entrepreneurial instinct. And I want you to think for a second about how hard it is to organize a boycott, right? I mean, you're essentially running a whole lot of businesses because you have to now supply all of the goods and services that the boycotted businesses were providing. And you have to do it without banks. You have to do it without, the law supporting you and stuff, right? So it takes a lot of ingenuity. The more people and the more kinds of people you have involved, the more likely that is to work out. And so if you're being violent, you don't have that many people and you don't have very many kinds of people. You will have fewer ideas. You will have fewer perspectives. Let me just I'm going to close here kind of chaotically with another Bayard Rustin example. So in that movie from a couple of years ago, there was this marvelous example of the kind of detailed entrepreneurial kind of thought that you have to have in order to pull off civil resistance. He was organizing the March on Washington, and they were going to have sack lunches for everybody, and they were about to make them cheese sandwiches, contrary to his order that they would be peanut butter sandwiches. Someone said, well, can't we just make them cheese sandwiches? He says, no. It's July in Washington, D.C. It's going to be hot. Cheese turns into scum and melts. It'll be disgusting. Peanut butter sandwiches. That's so incredibly detailed, right? Do you have any idea how many people you have to have involved in your movement before you have the person who notices something like that? That's what civil resistance makes possible. So the more people are like y'all who get involved and become leaders in the sense of people who will put in their contributions and their initiative, the better off we're going to be in the long run. So thank you very much for being here, and I will cut off at that point with complete chaos and disorder, which I strive to bring wherever I go.
Well, you've done a wonderful job sharing that information with us, Brian. Thank you so much for sitting with us here today. I want to just do one quick thing. Someone suggested as a question to stop sharing, and I didn't want to disrupt your vibe, so I'm going to stop the screen share now, and so now they can see you a little bit better. Um, I just wanted to solicit questions from the audience. We have a Q&A function, and you can submit your questions by going to the Q&A and writing in your question now, and we'll look at the questions that come in and mention them to Brian as they come in. I have some questions myself that I'd like to pose to Brian while those come in. First of all, I would love to know if you could assess the Tesla takedown movement in light of the pillars of support framework for us.
So, uh, sorry. So Musk is a part of a pillar of support. I mean, he's actually kind of two of them, right? So I said that we can distinguish between pillars of support who are the people who implement the decisions. And so, insofar as he was the head of Doggy, he was kind of doing that. Um, Insofar as he donated like $250 million to the Trump campaign, he certainly was a pillar of the other kind, the kind that wins obedience or acquiescence. I mean, he persuaded a lot of people to vote for the regime. Insofar as the Tesla takedown movement is taking money from him, it makes him less able to support Trump. And it makes it so that fewer people associate Trump with anything good, right? So, it's one of those, I don't know like any statistics, but I do know that Tesla has lost a huge amount of its stock value, and that is bad for Musk. And that might be why it is that Musk and Trump had their little, um, you know, dust up the other week, is because I'm sure they're both in terrible moods all the time because they're losing a bunch of money over nothing. Um, but yeah, I mean that is a case of, not attacking the regime directly, but trying to persuade a regime supporter to knock it off. And it wasn't a boycott. I mean, it's kind of, I don't know. I guess it is like a very low key boycott. I mean, you're encouraging people to boycott a company. But it wasn't a boycott in the way that nobody is actually shopping. Well, actually, I guess it is. Guys, I have a cold, so I'm losing a little bit of my coherence right this second. But
You're
it's
fine.
certainly the sort of thing that falls under the here's a person who is kind of part of a discrete group that makes it so that the regime has the structure that it has so that it can affect people in the way that it does. And here is a way to make that person less effective in that role or less willing to perform that role.
Thank you, Brian.
The
Another
fact that the guy's
question
own
came in.
rockets are blowing up before he can even launch them is probably not helping his mood either. So we can count reality as part of the resistance.
If I may ask, this came in from an anonymous attendee, what innovative resistance techniques have been used throughout history that you would like to see more of today?
Oh, ah, I mean, hmm. See, I'm not a strategist. So if I had such an idea, I would be trying to organize people around it. Um, I, I mean, for me personally, I like to just try to reason people out of bad ideas. Right. So for me personally, like staging debates and things like that, engaging in dialogue in the street or somewhere else, and media messaging is where it's at. But I'm not that kind of I'm not the strategist, right? I can identify the need for strategists and the structure of strategy, but I don't actually have those innovative ideas myself, right? I mean, that's why we need so many people. It's so that, like if the entire movement consisted of people like me, we could sit around and say, gosh, we ideas are great. We need more of them, but we wouldn't necessarily have the ones that we need. So, I think that the Tesla takedown was one such kind of a thing, and it was a certain kind of economic boycott. I don't know what we should be doing. I mean, part of the problem is that we don't like Trump wants to be an authoritarian, but they're not actually just arresting people by the tens of thousands or mowing us down in crowds or something like that, right? I mean, so it's only so bad at this point. So, I mean, it's not plain right now whether he is actually going to be largely restrained by the courts because a lot of his illegal actions are being overturned by the courts, right? And if that persists, then this is just an excruciatingly mediocre illegal presidency that is going to end, but we're still going to have elections and then civil resistance. I mean, it won't have ended up being, we won't need to be like the civil rights movement or the Indian independence movement, and we'll just be hopefully a really serious electoral bloc. But if it gets worse, right, if they keep arresting Democrats, certainly if the elections are tampered with, then we're going to need a lot of public civil disobedience, I think. But I'm not the creative one on this, right? So, I mean,
No
yeah,
sweat.
that's why we need
No
people.
sweat. I appreciate that. I appreciate the reflection back to the need for people and ideas in the movement and admitting that you're not the expert. I mean, you're not a historian, you're a philosopher, so you may not have that historical perspective that a historian would, but you do have a very valuable perspective nonetheless. Okay, so in terms of time, I think that it's probably best for us to shift gears now and go into breakout rooms. Brian, you're welcome to stay and participate in the next breakout room, which will actually go a little bit further into nonviolent civil resistance. So I'm going to go ahead and
Sure.
share my screen again, and go over to, I believe it's this screen. We're back at the screen we saw before. I go to the next one, and we did the Q&A. Now, I want to do a breakout group. So we've talked a little bit about the pillars of support that authoritarian regimes rely on. Brian referenced several of them, such as media, business, or law enforcement. What I'd love for your group to discuss is what is one institution in your community that helps uphold the Trump administration, and how might nonviolent action shift its role or weaken its support? Okay, we're gonna do a Menti question now, folks. Yeah, so back to Menti. I'm gonna invite everyone who I see everyone's gotten back into the rooms. We'll go into the Menti and I'll do another presentation. So pull out your phone if you could and go to menti.com and use the code that you see on the screen. Let's all do it together and we'll see what kind of pops up. How might nonviolent action weaken an institution in your community that helps uphold the Trump administration? Short responses are recommended, and you have 200 characters. I'll try and write something. Creates distrust, calls attention to the harm the institution causes, creates fear, slowly weakens public support. I think all things that brings negative attention, promotes critical thinking, strengthen a group of people who feel strongly about the spread of misinformation. Loss of profit creates change, call to action, boycott, withholding funds, remove what they want, which is money. Interesting. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for sharing that. Let's go back to the slides. and talk about what's coming up next. So looks like we're close to being out of time. I want to just now invite you to uh, go to the Google Classroom, which we went into depth in the first orientation, and I can let you know that we made a video of that, and it's a really great video to watch in case you want to kind of catch up. I'll put the links to everything that you see there. You can also take a picture of it with your phone to log into the Google Classroom or the Leadership Lab or the Discord and learning circles. Those are ways that you can continue to engage in this leadership course over the coming weeks and months. The Google Classroom is just a very simple place to watch a couple of videos and respond to a couple of questions to kind of prepare you for the sessions to come, because those videos and those questions will really kind of engage you, probably max 30 minutes of your time, both for the videos and the questions combined. The questions are now on the site, but they'll engage you to think about organizing and resistance. And we do have some great speakers coming up next week. But before that, we have Leadership Lab, where we intend to look through the answers to some of those questions and talk about them collectively as a group, and to assign roles like breakout room facilitators and things like that. We typically do that on Tuesday nights at 7. So do stop into the Leadership Lab if you're interested in doing that. And then if you want to take your learning even further, join the Discord, set up a learning circle where that can happen, and that'll probably likely happen in more frequency after we do the Discord session after session 2 and session 3. But next week we have 2 great speakers to talk about how we fight organizing and resistance. One's name is Paul van der Haar, and I work closely with Paul in the Hands Off Central Texas Coalition and Resist Austin Partnership. He's the treasurer of Hands Off Central Texas, and also Jeff Ordauer, who I've worked with in the context of some Tesla takedown work. He's a senior organizer associated with the Tesla takedown movement, and he's currently the co-lead of the Other Side project, which is an interesting project combating oligarchy in the United States. So do tune in for that next Thursday. But between now and then, check out the Google Classroom and the Leadership Lab and the Discord and learning circles. Finally, I want to give special recognition tonight to our breakout room facilitators. We had Tracy, Brittany, Braden, and Carolyn, who's not on the stage right now. So thanks all you folks. Thanks you folks who came in today, and special thanks to Brian Register, who is our guest speaker earlier tonight. Appreciate all of y'all. Have a great night, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you.